First of all, I want to establish that the shows I'm going to be recommending aren't just here because I think they are good. I'm specifically trying to recommend shows that I think a fan of Gravity Falls would enjoy. So even though Fight Club, for example, is a really great movie, I'm not going to recommend it here because it has virtually nothing in common with Gravity Falls. Understand the rules? Good. The obvious place to go from Gravity Falls is Inside Job. Inside Job in many ways feels like a successor to Gravity Falls, while still retaining the texture of its predecessor. This is a Netflix original animation with a banger theme song, and a premise that basically says, what if we took every conspiracy theory and then some that Gravity Falls fans cooked up while the show was airing and made those conspiracies real? It's a show about the deep state government and all the wacky characters who are employed by it. Scene by scene, Inside Job has a very similar ebb and flow to Gravity Falls, but with the content of episodes geared much more towards mature audiences. Drugs, sex, and domestic abuse are all subjects which get a lot of focus, both comedically and dramatically. And while the show builds up to some very dramatic and/or high-stakes sequences which are extremely effective as such, it pretty much always has a lot of fun doing so. Given the amount of time that has passed since Gravity Falls ended, it seems like perfectly understood that the audience who watched Gravity Falls at around the same age as its main characters were are young adults right now. And if you ask me, it did a great job gearing Inside Job towards people who loved witnessing all the creative monsters that were cataloged in Ford's journal, as well as the occasionally genuinely dark imagery or dialogue, and who are also now old enough to see a courtroom of lizard people having an orgy, which, let's be honest, probably isn't too far off from whatever was going on in Bill Cipher's dimension. The Owl House has by far the most similar look and feel to Gravity Falls out of anything on this list. Though I will say that the biggest issue I see with the Owl House for the purposes of this video is that it almost feels too similar to Gravity Falls. A few characters line up just a little too well with those from Gravity Falls, the art style is virtually identical, and frankly, Alex Hirsch's voice is just so recognizable that it was often hard for me to hear the character King and not just Alex himself. As a result, if you do like Gravity Falls more than the Owl House, you might find it hard not to constantly compare the two, and obviously Gravity Falls has set the bar really high. That is, at least until a good way into the Owl House, when it starts to take on plot points and character development routes that don't have so many one-to-one parallels. On the bright side of that coin though, the fact that the Owl House is so similar to Gravity Falls means that it shares a lot of the same strengths. Its characters are all likable by virtue of their childish and irresponsible tendencies, but who all have hearts of gold if you just dig a little. It does a good job weaving more serious plot threads together with its baseline carefree attitude. It occasionally dips into the same absurdly spontaneous comedic tendencies as Gravity Falls, and it has really fantastic production value. If you're a big fan of the moment-to-moment feel of Gravity Falls in the way that it constructs and resolves plot threads with each new episode, making it really nice to have playing when you're doing something else like eating dinner or putting a puzzle together, the Owl House can make it feel like you're watching Gravity Falls again, just in a bunch of new and inviting situations, even if the show's emotional tone is something more comparable to Steven Universe. And that might be exactly what you're looking for. Now, I will admit that I've only seen up to the first episode of Season 2 of Amphibia, but I hadn't seen it before writing this script, and I just don't have time to watch every show on this list that I hadn't seen before to completion. Still, from what I've seen, I can easily tell that Amphibia deserves a mention here. Whereas The Owl House feels like the same building blocks of Gravity Falls being used to create a different show, Amphibia has much more of its own personality, but still contains some of the same story concepts as Gravity Falls, specifically involving the uncovered history of the setting and the oldest main character's past. But the one thing that I think makes Amphibia a great watch for Gravity Falls fans is its comedic style. Amphibia has the
"Hey dude, you ready to blow up these hot dogs in the microwave one by one?"
Am I? One at a time! One at a time!
vibe down to a T, and it does it really, really well. If The Owl House will give you a similar vibe from the act of watching the show, then Amphibia will have moments that stick in your mind after the fact in the same way that Gravity Falls does.
"I ate a man alive tonight."
Amphibia also has a really strong sense of place like Gravity Falls does. It's as if the creators sat down and just thought out every nook and cranny of this town and how the people living in it commence themselves, and how all that compares and contrasts to the human world in a really believable way. This keeps it from getting stale after a while, which is really great since Amphibia isn't really focused on the handful of long-running plot threads it presents, which have greater potential story ramifications than the episodic adventures, unlike Gravity Falls, which gives these more serialized elements a lot more spotlight. Compounding this, I also don't think Amphibia has quite as memorable of a supporting cast as Gravity Falls, and so for me, this resulted in a world that felt incredibly well realized, just not with a whole lot going on in it. If you love Gravity Falls because of elements like the Society of the Blind Eye, which brings a lot of genuine narrative depth to the setting of Gravity Falls and the people who live in it, as well as coming into play later on in a really dramatic and impactful way that is the catalyst for even more depthful character and setting development, you might feel like Amphibia is missing something. However, it really does capture the same raw, unapologetically impulsive fun that Gravity Falls is so well known for, so I would still strongly recommend it. And I'm just gonna throw this in here, Amphibia also has a fantastic soundtrack, especially the opening and ending themes, which establish the perfect atmosphere for the show and play a non-negligible role in making the setting feel, as I described earlier, very well realized, just like Gravity Falls. Avatar: The Last Airbender is an obvious one, so much so that I struggle to even believe that anyone looking for shows to watch after Gravity Falls wouldn't have already seen it, but on the off chance that you're one of those people, you should definitely give it a shot. While the story it tells is much grander, more of a traditional hero's journey, and is taken much more seriously than Gravity Falls on a more frequent basis, a lot of the moment-to-moment character interactions are similar to it. They very naturally play off of how each personality in the main group bounces off one another, which is done in a way that simultaneously makes you laugh and makes everyone on screen feel that much more three-dimensional. And many of the one-liners or freeze frames from The Last Airbender have forever cemented themselves in cartoon memery. Furthermore, it's also got a seemingly infinite wealth of background details that flesh out its world and the different characters in it. It's like what I said about Amphibia, but the world actually is filled to the brim with interesting things going on, even when they rarely get much focus, especially when they don't get much focus. So if you're the type who loves digging into Gravity Falls wiki forums and watching YouTube videos to learn about all the different species and instances of foreshadowing, you just might enjoy this aspect of Avatar as well. If, on the other hand, you were less into the world building and wider reaching implications of the world that Gravity Falls took place in, and are looking for something more about character drama that comes in the package of a tightly constructed kids animation, then I think that The Mitchells vs. the Machines is a solid place to look. A big aspect of Gravity Falls is the theme of growing up, and how each half of our main duo deals with it. And while I don't think that The Mitchells vs. the Machines has any more of a nuanced take on the matter than Gravity Falls, it can still be considered a sort of advancement of those themes, seeing as its main character, Katie, is growing up in the sense that she is moving away to college, entering her adult years, whereas Dipper and Mabel are just entering their teenage years. Both are coming-of-age stories, but Gravity Falls is about coming of age internally, accepting that childhood ends and being okay with that.
Summer's over, Candy. It's time for us to grow up.
But not too much.
Whereas The Mitchells vs. the Machines is about the desire for independence that naturally comes with literally being an adult, and how that will affect the relationships around you. Both are very resonant themes, and as I mentioned earlier, the people who were around Dipper and Mabel's age at the time of Gravity Falls are probably either currently experiencing Katie Mitchell's situation right now, or did experience it pretty recently. So I think that if you saw yourself in Dipper and or Mabel, you might very well enjoy The Mitchells vs. the Machines for the same reason. And as a bonus, the movie does a very good job at performing the zany comedy style that Gravity Falls uses occasionally, only here it's cranked up to absolute 11. It feels like an entire film of the Mabel's Guide to shorts that were released on YouTube, which should tell you everything you need to know about the overall tone, whether that's a good or bad thing for you. Now, this is a particular one. The Netflix original animation Hilda. This is an adaptation of a series of graphic novels by Luke Pearson, and it's one of the few shows on this list that I don't think feels very much like Gravity Falls on a moment-to-moment basis at all. For once on this list, comedy is not a central focus of the series. The majority of Hilda is meant to make the viewer feel as comfy as possible, rather than to make them laugh. However, it taps into the same sense of unknowable wonder which Gravity Falls is so well known for better than I think anything else on this list. Specifically, I want to recommend the first 3 episodes, as I think they conjure this feeling in the viewer the best out of pretty much the entire show. Hilda takes place in the kind of world that could easily have a journal or 3 written about the incredible number of bizarre and fantastic creatures that live in it. In fact, the very first scene in the show contains Hilda literally sketching out pictures of one of these creatures. It's not hard to imagine that by Ford's age, she would have also built herself a cabin in the woods just to dedicate her life to studying the unending weirdness surrounding her on all sides. If you're the type who, while watching Gravity Falls, was completely captivated by the idea that everywhere you turn there would be new bizarre species that you had never before seen and that may or may not be a little dangerous, I would strongly recommend Hilda. And if you felt endeared to the characters by the end of the first 3 episodes, you'll definitely enjoy the rest of the series. By the way, if you want to hear me talk more about Hilda, I've made videos discussing seasons 1, 2, and the movie, which dropped on New Year's. Card in the corner. Which actually brings me to my last point. Hilda is still ongoing. Season 3, which as far as we know will be the finale of the story, has yet to come out at the time of making this video. So if being a member of an active fanbase was part of the appeal of Gravity Falls for you, as it was for myself and so many others, that's just one more reason to get into Hilda. Unless obviously you're from the future. The only other show which comes to mind that shares these qualities with Gravity Falls would be Maiden Abyss, which is an anime, so naturally don't expect to get the same type of comedic value out of it that you would get from Gravity Falls. But similar to it and Hilda, it centralizes around a massive and incredibly fascinating world. With crazy creatures around every turn, it's super fun to catalog all the different species, you get the gist. Unlike Hilda though, Maiden Abyss also has some really dramatic and captivating central mysteries, which the characters are just as interested in solving as the audience. Just as Ford and Dipper try to figure out the source of all the weirdness in Gravity Falls, Maiden Abyss wants to figure out what is at the bottom of that giant hole. And again, this is an ongoing series with a huge and dedicated fanbase. However, I must warn you that Maiden Abyss, in stark contrast with anything else I've recommended, can and will get really dark, especially in comparison to the other stuff on this list. This isn't really a spoiler since it's part of the show's premise, but people can travel down into the abyss just fine. However, when ascending up out of the abyss, individuals will experience nausea, headaches, vertigo, hallucinations, bleeding from every orifice of one's body, complete sensory deprivation, loss of humanity, and death. That's just to give you a taste of what kind of world this show takes place in, but trust me, I've only scratched the surface. Needless to say, the unknowable wonder that I think is a big part of the appeal of Gravity Falls is very much present here as well. However, it leans much more into the idea that the environment the characters are surrounded by is genuinely dangerous, invoking more of a sense of horror that is literally awesome, worthy of awe. The full package of Maiden Abyss is probably the least like the full package of Gravity Falls out of anything in this video, but if you specifically loved the utter amazement of exploring the abandoned ship in Dipper and Mabel vs. the Future, or that hollow sinking feeling in your gut that episodes like Into the Bunker would touch on, you can find a lot more of where that came from in Maiden Abyss. And lastly, I gotta talk about Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty is a weird one because there's also a lot about it that I think might drive Gravity Falls fans away from it, depending on what type of fan you're talking about.
I'm gonna need you to take these seeds into the bathroom, and I'm gonna need you to put them way up inside your butthole, Morty.
In my butt?
Put them way up inside there, as far as they can fit.
Oh, jeez, Rick.
The difference in maturity rating is an obvious example. Rick and Morty is extremely crass and will hit you with some pretty dark and serious beats. But I feel like Gravity Falls and Rick and Morty both come from a similar place in terms of creative expression. Both shows seem intent on having fun. Not making the audience have fun necessarily, though they almost always do that anyway. Rather, I feel like the construction of each narrative element of each show, each bizarre out-of-left-field plot twist or punchline, was added to the show because it was just an idea that spawned in someone's head who was on the creative team. It doesn't feel like either show is building off a pre-established formula for how animated family comedies should be. It feels like both shows have their own really compelling underpinning plot threads and greater goals for the narrative. And in the process of getting there, we experience every spontaneous and unique and delightfully weird idea that each show has along the way. I always like to bring up how Rick giving himself a catchphrase is the same energy as the countless instances of Gravity Falls characters breaking out into chanting for no reason. Both shows are self-indulgent in a way that is simply addicting to watch. And moreover, just like Gravity Falls, Rick and Morty's craftsmanship is unquestionably masterful. Despite feeling so off the walls at so many points, it so clearly knows how to construct a really dramatic and compelling series of characters while using their wacky elements to enhance their and the story's development. The existence of the famous, or infamous, depending on how you look at it, Pickle Rick meme is the perfect encapsulation of this. It is so stupid on its face, and it presents itself as such, and still manages to make Rick turning himself into a pickle into one of the most telling episodes about his character and relationship with his family. No, I'm not joking. And of course, there are no shortage of aspects of the story which are likely to appeal to Gravity Falls fans purely on their conceit. Rick and Morty explores a huge fantasy universe containing all sorts of creatively conceived inhuman species. It has a massive and multi-season spanning mystery appeal centered around key characters, their personal secrets, and their plans for the future. And then of course there's just stuff like the Gravity Falls Easter eggs in Rick and Morty that materialize due to the friendship between Alex Hirsch and Justin Roiland. It feels hardest to quantify what it is about Rick and Morty exactly that makes me feel like Gravity Falls fans specifically would enjoy it so much. Maybe it's all the Easter eggs, maybe it's the mysteries, maybe it's just something that is unquantifiable. But the more I watch the two and the more I learn about each of them, the more it feels like they simply fit together. Also, one half of Rick and Morty's main duo has an awkward pubescent crush on a taller redhead for which he gets made fun of constantly by the other main character, so do with that information what you will. Alright, that's a pretty decent list. I haven't seen everything that's ever been made, so there's obviously going to be a lot of shows and movies that I would have put on this list had I seen them. For instance, Alex Hirsch has stated that Gravity Falls is like the baby of The Simpsons and Twin Peaks, so those are probably good places to look also. But I haven't seen The Simpsons, and I've only seen the first 2 episodes of Twin Peaks, which did not give me a Gravity Falls impression outside of the fact that it focuses on a big mystery and contains some eccentric characters. But I don't know, maybe the parallels become way more apparent as it goes on. I'm just kind of having fun doing this. I'm not trying to actually make a comprehensive shows like Gravity Falls spreadsheet, but if you feel like doing that, the comments are right there. So yeah. Anyway, support me on Patreon and have a good day. Twin Peaks